everybody. Welcome. Thank you for listening at home or later for our talk today with our distinguished speaker, author of Midnight Assassin, which we'll explain more in detail in a little bit. But my name is Lindsay Bytoff. I am the director of the spring play here at Perimeter College, Jury of Her Peers, which is an adaptation that I worked on of Susan Glaspell's timeless, classic, unforgettable play, Trifles. So something we're doing today is we're having Patricia Bryan here. Patricia is the Henry P. Brandis Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina. As I mentioned, she's the author of Midnight Assassin. So a little bit about that is, and I have the book here as well, is essentially the play Trifles is based off of a real crime that happened in the state of Iowa, in the year 1900. And what Patricia, along with her husband as well, have put together is a wonderful, amazingly researched, just deep dive into rural Iowan life and trial by media and essentially the treatment of women in the criminal justice system. It's a really incredible book. And as a director, it really helped me, and in adapting this play as well, to be aware of and have this information, have this resource. And so on sort of a whim and a dream, I asked Sally Robertson, who's our chair, can I please email Patricia Bryan and just see if maybe she'd want to come by and speak to us. And she so graciously has said yes. So we're gonna talk a little bit about today, because we had a Talkback last night where we talked a little bit about criminal justice, sort of history of law, women on juries, because at the time this play was written and the time the crime occurred, women did not have any protective rights to serve on juries, and it was very, very uncommon, if not, not done, full stop. As well as obviously not the right to vote, even.
Right.
So, is there anything you wanted to say as well, an introduction before we dive into talking about the book a bit more?
Yes,
please.
Well, I will first say, if you have not seen the production, I really recommend that you do. It's an incredibly impressive and emotional and powerful performance by the actors, and I really commend Lindsay for the way she has
Thanks, everybody.
adapted the play. I really wholeheartely recommend it to you. As I have said to Lindsay, I've seen productions of Trifles before, but this is certainly one of the best. So I would recommend that you come. And
Thank you for that. That's very sweet.
And I appreciate the fact that Lindsay says that my book provided background for the actors, because I think they have really inhabited their characters, and the set and the lighting and the music really bring together what life was like, and what Minnie Foster, the main character, how she lived, and the reality of what she experienced, which is a big part of the play and was a big part of the real case.
I'm going to set that up there as well so we can see it at all times. Thank you for that. That's so incredibly kind. So moving into, I guess we want to just talk a little bit about when did you first find out about the Hossack case? Because that's what the case, the real names of the people in the play. They're Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T,
right.
Which also has a fun kind of similarity to right and wrong, obviously.
She hoped she was marrying Mr. Wright.
Right. Unfortunately, no.
Right.
So the Hossack case, and obviously I know you went to college in Iowa.
I did.
As well, so I'm wondering if maybe that's kind of when you kind of learned about Susan or the case, or which came first, chicken or the egg?
Well, it really is not, although I think it did give me an interest in following it through. Mm-hmm. I teach at North Carolina a law and literature seminar, and when I was first teaching it, I wasn't sure what the syllabus would be, and found that the syllabus all over the country very varied. Because law and literature is not a clear connection. Mm-hmm. So I looked at the top 10 works that were recommended for law and literature courses, and 9 of them were what you would expect: Shakespeare and Dickens and Kafka and Camus. There was only one by a woman, and that was A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell. And that caught my interest right away, and so I read it and was very moved, and decided to try to find a little bit more about Susan Glaspell. And she was a reporter, 23 years old, when she was sent from Des Moines, where she had been reporting on legislative activities. And her first criminal case was the Hossick murder, where a woman, Margaret Hossick, who had been married for 37 years to John Hossick, was accused of killing her husband with an axe while he slept, and she slept next to him. She claimed she didn't wake up. There were 5 children in the house at the time. They all supported her in her claim of innocence. Nevertheless, the county attorney fixated on her right away as the main suspect. So what interested me initially was just why Susan Glaspell, at such a young age, had come up with this criticism of the legal system. And Jury of Her Peers and Trifles clearly shows that she had found injustice. And she was not a lawyer. She had had no experience in the law. So that was how I came to look into the Hossick case. And I found a newspaper article that said Susie Glaspell, the one woman reporter, surrounded by men. All of the authorities, both the people who investigated the crime and the judge and the lawyers and all of the jury members were men. There were women in the courtroom, but few of them testified. And when they did testify, they were often interrupted or ignored. So there Susie Glaspell was, reporting on the case. So that was really the trigger.
So she was the way in.
She was the way in, exactly. But I do think that, finding out that she was an Iowan kept my interest.
Yeah.
And I wrote an article in the Stanford Law Review about the connection between law and literature and Trifles in the Hossick case. And then I was ready to be finished with it, but my husband, Tom Wolfe, said no.
There's more here.
Yeah, in the Stanford article, it seemed like he said all of the good facts were in the footnotes. If you've ever looked at a law review article, it is mostly footnotes on a page. So he encouraged me to go more into the story and into Susan Glaspell. One of the ways we started doing it was we put an advertisement in the local Indianola and the rural newspapers that said, "Who killed John Hossick?"
Wow.
Because we wondered, it's a community where a lot of people stay. They have family farms. Yeah. So there are children who inherit the farms and keep up the farms. And amazingly, there were people that, maybe not amazingly, but there were people who had heard about the Hossick case. And I was able to talk to one distant grandchild of the Hossicks and one was a great-great-grandchild, a woman from the Hossick. So I was able to learn about the stories that had passed through the generations, as well as the stories that were told in the community. So the research that we did was more of a, well, as you say, deep dive into what really went on in the Hossick family.
Yeah. How many people answered the ad?
Well, the first person who answered the ad said, "I've been writing a novel. Can you tell me about an agent that you might?" But there were people who answered the ad. Well, I had a toll-free number. That was what the law school established for me, so they could call. And there were people who answered anonymously. And there was one person who asked, "Why were we investigating the case? Are you trying to point a finger of guilt at someone in the community?" Wow. Which we were really, we were interested in finding out who did it. Yeah. That was our initial hope. But, that was sort of interesting.
Was it a male or female voice?
It was a female.
Interesting.
Yeah, and when we went, we visited a number of times to the community, and we did talk to a lawyer who claimed that his father or grandfather had some connection with the case, and he told us that he would advise us not to look further into the case, that he could not tell us what he knew, that there was a responsibility of confidentiality, but he did advise us to look into this one specific court case, and he couldn't tell us why, but it was a little clue that really didn't lead us anywhere, and he refused to talk to us. He did talk to us a little bit, but he refused to tell us very much. So it seemed pretty clear that there was another story that was still circulating, but they were not willing to tell us to us as outsiders. And there were people who talked to us and said, "Do not use my name." So, 100 years later, more than 100 years later, people were still talking about it.
Right, so it's not outside the realm of possibility that when it happened, because it helps you go back and say when it happened, how nobody wanted to come forward then and talk about their marriage and talk about
exactly
all that.
And there was one person we spoke to who was alive at the time, but she was a baby.
Wow, yeah.
And was, of course,
1900, yeah.
And was carried out of the house, and she remembers that her father had gone to the farm, but she really didn't know anything about it except what her parents said. And maybe not surprisingly, again, her mother thought that Margaret Hossick had not done it, and her father was convinced that Margaret Hossick had done it. So there was clearly this split.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the trial is, of course, the men were the ones in charge. They had the weight of authority. And they were convinced that she had done it, and they were the ones who stood in judgment of, she had a defense attorney, but it was a prosecutor who told the story that was most appealing to the male jury members.
Landowners,
Well,
men of the same age as John Hossick,
and even
etc.
people who knew John Hossick were on the inquest jury.
Right.
People who had told Margaret Hossick, "Do not talk to your neighbors about your complaints." She had gone to these men and said, "My husband, I'm afraid of my husband. He's threatening me and my children with a gun." The women said they couldn't do anything, and the men wouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
In fact, she tried to escape, and the men in the community took her back home and spoke to her and her children and said, "We do not want to hear anything more about this. It's within the family." They didn't think about domestic abuse.
Yeah.
And in fact, as we talked about last night, the men were invested in the two of them staying together. They didn't want to think about the possibility that a woman, their wife, their daughter, could commit such a violent act against a man. Who was it who said in the audience last night?
One of the retired professors,
Yeah,
I think
it's
it was.
open season on men.
Yeah, it was well said.
Right.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's so fragilely held together.
Right. But the men don't want to believe that.
Right.
And it's interesting thinking about how the lawyers argued it, because it was very similar actually to the way the lawyers argued in the Lizzie Borden case, which was some years before in Fall River, Massachusetts. Because in that case, both the defense and the prosecutor relied on images of women to convince the men on the jury that a woman either could or could not have committed this crime. And Lizzie Borden, came to the courtroom dressed in finery and a hat and cried.
She was young and unmarried as well.
She was young and unmarried and pretty. And so presented this image of a true woman, which was what the prosecutor claimed she was. How can you imagine that a woman like Lizzie Borden could possibly have committed this? And even though there were no other suspects in the Lizzie Borden case, she was acquitted. In Margaret Hossick's case, the prosecutor, here was a slightly heavy woman,
Sturdy.
a farm woman,
Yeah.
sturdy. I mean, all of their wives and daughters were sturdy also.
Yeah.
But they were able to paint her as someone who was outside a true woman. And they didn't want to believe, again, that their wives and daughters could have done this. So they talked about her as and this is Susan Glaspell paints this as a bad housekeeper, a poor mother. I mean, the prosecutor said either she slept through the attack, which means she wouldn't have woken up if her children had cried, or she was lying. One or the other, guilty, either way.
Yeah.
And the defense had to rely on the argument that she had tried to reconcile with her husband.
Mm-hmm.
They pretty much denied the abuse. They didn't completely deny it, but said it had stopped. Margaret Hosack had become an obedient, a subservient wife, had tried to make a happy home for her husband. So, the abuse really was the evidence that the prosecutor used to show that she had a motive.
Mm-hmm.
It was not used in any way in mitigation of her crime. And that's what I think Susan Glaspell was trying to show, that the abuse, and the women realized this, that if the men, they couldn't comprehend the despair and the desolation and the isolation of her life, and even if they had been able to, they would have seen it as she was the one who most wanted to kill John Wright,
Yeah.
which is what the prosecutors argued in the Hosack case.
Yeah.
So in the Hosack case, none of the reality of Margaret Hosack's life was presented to the jury. And of course, they were all operating on their own biases.
Right.
That she wasn't a good housekeeper, she wasn't a good woman because she hadn't made a happy home for her husband.
But we briefly last night this idea that no question about how she was blocked from doing so. Right. How could that be? That it could be impossible.
It was her
no matter how hard she
responsibility.
tried. Yeah.
And of course, Susan Glaspell hints at, or mentions this. It was also true in the Hosack case that the men talked about John Hosack as one of the most respected men in the community.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the witnesses actually said, there has been no man as good as John Hosack since Abraham Lincoln. That is a quote.
They were really going for it. They were
Yeah,
really trying to.
they were really
stretch
trying.
it. Yeah.
And of course, Susan Glaspell says he paid his debts on time, he was well respected. So he was sort of this paradigm of virtue. And Margaret Hosack sort of torn down as being outside the image of what a true woman was.
Yeah.
So in doing the Hosack research, it really enriched my understanding of what Susan Glaspell saw when she wrote Trifles and what she saw as lacking, which was, both the broader perspective that was lacking, and that was necessary as she saw it to do justice,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that the moral questions of culpability, both of John Wright and of the neighbors and of herself, were not considered in the courtroom. And I think, it took her a long time. She had really matured by the time she wrote Trifles.
Mm-hmm.
It was 15 years later.
Yeah.
And she had become much more of a feminist. She was friends with Margaret Sanger, who was the leader of the birth control movement. She lived in Greenwich Village. She had moved to Provincetown to start the Provincetown Theater Company.
Mm-hmm.
So she had matured from the very young reporter she was in 1901, but this stayed with her. The story about how she came to write Trifles was that Jig Cook, her husband, and in fact she had fallen in love with him when he was married. A free thinker, progressive.
That's
she
very
was.
Greenwich Village style. I
Yeah,
feel
right.
like.
Right.
Free spirits.
And he had divorced, not common at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and married Susan Glaspell, who I will say kept her own name, which is interesting,
Yeah.
for the times. And they moved to Greenwich Village, they moved to Provincetown, started the Provincetown Theater Company. Jig Cook encouraged her to write a play. She had written a play, the two of them had written the first play, but she did not want to write another play. She said, I'm not a playwright. She had published short stories, many short stories before that, but didn't want to write another play. And he insisted, we need a play. So she went, they were performing the theater at the time in a small house at the end of a wharf. And she said she went to the end of the wharf and sat there, and suddenly to her mind came a vision of the kitchen of a woman. And she says, a woman where she had gone when she was a young reporter, and where she saw in her mind at this point some women and some men come into the kitchen and see this desolated, isolated farmhouse. And it came to her that what she was seeing was the farmhouse of Margaret Hossett. And it's really interesting.
Amazing.
She must have been thinking about that. It stayed with her. But it wasn't until her husband encouraged her, forced her to write this play, and then she went her own way.
And kept writing plays.
And
Yeah.
She wrote plays. She wrote her first novel in 1910. She had written many short stories before that, and then continued writing plays. And in fact, one of her last plays, not her last, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1931 perhaps. Allison's House.
Allison's House, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
Nice.
she became very well known, but then, as so many women writers, sort of fell into obscurity and was rediscovered by the feminist canon in the 1970s. And now Trifles, well, you know this, Lindsay, is the most well-performed one-act play in America. And Jury of Her Peers is often included in short story anthologies. So and I will just mention, we wrote the book Midnight Assassin. We also have a website, midnightassassin.com. We were able to get that name. And we have there pictures that we could find of Margaret and of the dead body of John. I mean, there was a photographer who took the body. And we have a lot about the children and what happened afterward. She was convicted in the first trial. She was retried. The Supreme Court overturned the trial on the basis of technicality. She was retried in a different county. The women who were in the courtroom in that county came to shake her hand while she was at the witness table. I mean, they really were much more explicit in supporting her. And she was not acquitted. There were 9 men on the jury who voted to convict her. In the first trial, the prosecutor had recommended that she be sentenced to death. In the second trial, the prosecutor was arguing for life in prison. But 9 men wanted to convict her. 3 men who held out, whether they were influenced by their wives, we never know.
You better do it.
Right, exactly.
You better not convict that old lady.
Or else.
Yeah,
right.
That poor old woman who's just frail, as you said at that point.
Frail and sort of her children surrounded her. I mean, the defense had an easier time, I think, showing that she was a good mother, sort of not really the Lizzie Borden type, but at least not the monster that she had been portrayed in the first trial. So it was a hung jury. She was sent back, she went back to live in her rural community and was accepted. I mean, we don't know of any animosity that was held toward her. And in fact, it seems likely that not only the women but the men at that point understood that she was no danger to anyone. She hadn't been a danger to anyone except John Hossett.
Right.
And she was justified. I think both the women and perhaps even the men understood why she had done what she did. So, no danger to anyone. She lived her life very quietly. As I mentioned last night, she was buried next to her husband. Mm-hmm. They lie side by side in the burial ground, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. That detail you included about how his grave stands taller than hers.
Right. And hers
like he's still shadowing over her.
Well,
in
exactly.
A way, a little bit.
Her grave is just a little plaque, whereas his has sort of a pedestal rising up. You can visit the graves, and in fact, people in the community do visit the graves, I've been told. And again, have these controversies: the men, the women, who killed John Hossack.
Yeah, and the scene of her arrest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, she and surrounded by her children were walking away from the burial ground when the sheriff, who was waiting in a buggy outside at the very end of the path, came up and said, "We have to arrest you." And she was crying. When she cried at the end of the trial, one of the reporters wrote, "At least she has now showed that she is a woman." Because she shed tears, right?
Wow.
I mean, really. But she was surrounded by her children, and she was taken to the jail, where interesting, and this is something that Susan Glaspell picks up on, the sheriff's wife tended to her. And the sheriff's wife in the Hossack case sat by Mrs. Hossack during the entire trial. She was there with her defense attorneys and then the sheriff's wife. And the sheriff's wife talked to her and took her away after the trial. And I think, Susan Glaspell saw that.
Yeah.
And I think that is obviously why she has Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, who understand her in a way that the men cannot possibly understand her.
And that Mrs. Peters, at the end, not to spoilers, right? But that she leaves the story in a way that it's plausible that that's the next, steps she takes. So if this story was canon and part of real life, that we would imagine that's what Mrs. Peters might do.
Exactly.
Is be there for Minnie because she's in a position to do
Right.
so.
Right.
Whereas Mrs. Hale has to go back to her farm and her children and
Right.
take care of all of that.
I mean,
she
the
can't.
hope, of course, and this isn't clear in Susan Glaspell, will Minnie Wright be tried?
Right.
And if she is tried, will she be convicted? And I posited last night, well, yeah, probably she would be convicted, even without the bird, because there were no other suspects. There was no sign of a break-in. Certainly the defense would argue, well, she claims she's innocent. How could a woman like that put a rope around her neck, his neck? But again, there would be neighbors who testified to the abuse, and that would be the motive.
Yeah, and Henderson seems motivated as a lawyer.
Exactly.
So I
Exactly.
think that's, he's not going to let it go.
No, in the Hossack case, as I said, the prosecutor narrowed in on her and never really investigated the sons, who had just as much of a motive, really, or neighbors. John Hossack had political arguments with some of the neighbors. There was some theory in the neighborhood that John Hossack had been friendly with one of the neighbor women. That was never really discussed in the trial. The prosecutors at that point, there hadn't been many convictions. And I think they'd often been overturned on the basis of forensic evidence, mishandling of forensic evidence.
Continued to do.
Yeah, exactly. Continued to do. So he wanted to prove that the trial system could work. So he zeroed in on Mrs. Hossack and thought he could prove it, and in fact did. So,
And I think, my interpretation as well is that Margaret was a good person who didn't want to speak ill, even of people who, a person who feasibly did terrible things to her and made her life very unpleasant. And maybe the prosecutor saw that as an easy target.
right.
And being a woman in that time on top of all of that as well.
Yeah, at the inquest, they asked her about what had happened, and her response, this is the last thing she said, is, before, I hope you do not think that I killed him. He was too good a man for me to have done that. And this is after the neighbors had testified of her coming to their houses and pleading and crying for help. She must have known that that testimony would have been presented. And yet, as you say, Lindsay, this feeling that she was to blame, she felt that even then, that this is a sphere of family privacy. And what's sad is, of course, that we see that today, that women often, too many times, will call for help, call the police, and then when the police come, they don't want to press charges. They don't want to admit what has happened, and even if they do, we all know they're often victimized again by the legal system. And Susan Glaspell was really before her time. What's sad is that it hasn't changed that much. Yes, we have women on juries now, and we have women lawyers, and we have women judges, but the socialization of abused women in fearing to admit what happened and fearing that they would be blamed and thinking that they are to blame, I think is really so sad. At least now we have places where women can go. That was something Mrs. Hossack had no financial independence.
Right, we said, what would she do? What's her option?
She had no option.
Yeah.
She wasn't allowed to own property. She couldn't have gone elsewhere and had a place to live. There weren't any services. I think we mentioned in the book that at the time, women during the winter, you could hear women being carted off in wagons, screaming because they were being taken to the insane asylum. You imagine the overwork that they had, the lack of reward, and the cold winters that they suffered.
Isolated,
desolated, despair, abuse. Their husbands had terrible situations too, but they could take it out both on their farm wives and on their animals.
Right.
Amazing even today how linked animal abuse is to wife abuse. You often, in fact, I read an article about domestic abuse and how she uses that to teach about animal law, and how many pets are abused in domestic abuse cases as a way to terrorize the woman, which is the parakeet.
That's a great point. The bird in the story.
Something that the wife loves. And if you're not careful, this is what will happen to you. A kind of physical abuse vicariously.
By proxy.
Exactly.
Wow, that's wild. All right, we probably have time for one more little thought/question, unless there's a question in the house today that we want to ask Patricia. I've got some here, but I just wanted to check in. No? Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to ask. Let's see. So just a brief, I guess, because I'm curious, this is my question, is Susan changed things about the real case for the play and for the short story, and why do you think that might be?
Well, I can talk about that, and I can talk about the next book that we have forthcoming.
Yeah, please.
She certainly changed things in the Hossack trial. She made Minnie Wright childless. She changed the way that Minnie Wright, if we believe Minnie Wright did it, which Susan Glaspell, I think, makes clear. She doesn't want us to think about guilt or innocence. She wants us to think about whether the men could do justice. She changes the rope from the axe as a way to connect the bird. And I think she changes the lack of children as a way to emphasize the isolation that Minnie Wright had. What's interesting is that when we were in Anamosa visiting to find out more about Margaret Hossack, we heard about another case, a young child, an 11-year-old boy, who had killed his parents and who was sentenced to Anamosa for life. While he was at Anamosa, the wardens took him under their wings and educated him, and he fought by writing letters and earning the respect of influential people in Iowa. He earned the respect of Iowans, well-known Iowans, but there was a bitter fight in the legislature, the General Assembly, about whether he should be paroled or not. And
what year was this?
This was in 1889.
Oh, wow, okay, so before
1889, yes,
Wow.
but he overlapped for a year with Margaret Hossick in Anamosa. No evidence that they knew each other.
Yeah.
But she wrote a short story in 1902 about Wesley Elkins. And I didn't know about that until I found out about the Wesley Elkins case. But as we researched the Wesley Elkins case, thinking, oh, well, this is another Iowa true crime.
Yeah.
You know,
What's going on, Iowa?
all of a sudden, I find, what, Susan Glaspell wrote a story about this? And it was called In the Face of His Constituents. She renamed it later The Plea. And she changed the facts to a certain extent. But what she did was to show the need for empathy for the boy, and that he really had changed. He had been a child when he committed this crime. He had matured and become educated. And in fact, in the real case, he did live an upstanding life. He was in Anamosa for 12 years and was eventually pardoned, and he was eventually paroled. 10 years later was pardoned. Never had children, but he did become a well-respected citizen. Not a well-known, he lived a very quiet life. But Susan Glaspell really gave the message, we need empathy for him. Tom and I wrote a book, it's called The Plea, the true story of young Wesley Elkins and his struggle for redemption. That will be published by the University of Iowa Press this summer in July.
All right.
We have a chapter, just as we do in Midnight Assassin, about Susan Glaspell writing the short story. It was just coincidence, as I say, that we happened to find that, but we knew a lot about Susan Glaspell at that point. So, well, of course, I recommend that book.
Well, it's in time. My birthday's in August, so it's a perfect timing.
No surprise.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're at time for today, but thank you so much, and we'll give a hand for our guest, Patricia Bryan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure for me to be here.
Yeah, pleasure to have you. Yeah, and we'll hopefully see all of you at the show tonight, 8 p.m., and tomorrow, 3 p.m. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.